So guys, I've never told you all this yet, but back, probably 15 years ago, I used to be an IASCA judge. And if you're not sure what IASCA is, it's the International Auto Sound Competition Association. And during that, I judged both sound quality as well as dB. I was big into car stereos. I mean, I really had some pretty built-out systems. I was a big fan of companies like Linear Power, Soundstream, Kicker, as well as JL, and all sorts of the high-end brands back then. I really haven't followed it much in the last decade or so, and I've pretty much gotten completely out of the entire, modified sound system arena ever since a lot of the vehicles that I've owned have really come with nice sounding systems. When I was driving a certain luxury car brand for, probably 10 years, I went through, I think, 7 of them, the factory sound system was so impressive that I never felt the need to upgrade it. And not only that, the way they built it into the dash was not really conducive to upgrade. That's kind of the same scenario I have here with this truck. I have one of my very first videos that I made, probably 2 years ago, on my 2011 F250 that I had, where I replaced the factory stereo, which was the traditional Ford stereo, with a Pioneer aftermarket navigation system. And I talked about how it really made the factory sound system sound great. I mean, it really added a lot of clarity. It improved the imaging, the staging, it improved the bass response. The preamp outputs going to the factory Sony subwoofer really livened up the subwoofer, and it gave it a much better sound. And all the factory speakers were louder and clearer than the factory head unit that was in that truck. Well, in this truck I have the Sony system and the in-dash 8-inch navigation system. And as you can see, there'd really be no way to swap this system out without some pretty in-depth surgery to replace it with something else. So what I want, though, is more bass response. And there's a factory sub in the back in its own factory plastic enclosure with a 6-channel Sony amplifier that's mounted onto the box. Now, my previous truck only had an amplifier in the back for the subwoofer, but it wasn't the premium sound system. This truck has the Sony system, which is considered a premium sound system, and the Sony amplifier in the back, which is supposedly 600 watts or somewhere in that range, powers all the speakers. So if I removed the amplifier from the back, I would lose amplification to all my speakers and you wouldn't hear anything. So what I wanted to do was bypass just the subwoofer portion, replace my subwoofer with a better upgraded subwoofer, and add an amplifier to improve the sound. And I'll show you what I did. So here's the setup that I've added. I have this XC2110 Clarion amp, and this is a really cool little amplifier. It pushes out 200 watts RMS at 4 ohms and 300 watts RMS at 2 ohms bridged. Now, what I like about this amp, and the reason I went with this amp versus a traditional style amp, is A, it's a marine grade amp, so it's sealed. It has all the wires already coming out of it, including your low and high level output wires. So it gives you stereo high level input. What that means is that it lets you connect your factory speaker wires directly to the amp and not need RCA cables. RCA cables are generally ran from your aftermarket head unit that has RCA outputs, and it's a low level or a preamp input. Whereas your speaker outputs or your speaker wires that are going to your factory speakers have power behind them, and because that power is much greater than what the RCAs can handle, you have to generally get what's called a line output converter, which converts your speaker power into preamp power for your amplifier. Well, this amp has the preamp wires already ran to it. Now, it doesn't have your traditional screw-style terminals that you would tighten your wires on. It just gives you some pigtail leads that come out of it, and you connect your high-level input wires directly to them. And then it automatically monos the channel down and gives you 2-wire output right here to go directly to your subwoofer. And then this blue wire is your remote power on wire from your amp. So I ran from the PTO, or power takeoff system. There's a harness underneath the dash up near the front kick panel that is actually labeled auxiliary power. So I ran a 18 gauge power cable and connected it to this blue power cable right here for my remote amp turn on. I ran a 10 gauge power lead from the hood all the way back to give me my connection for power, and the amp has a 12 gauge wire going into it. I ran a 10 gauge ground wire down to the floor jack bolting system that holds the mount in place, and I connected it to this 12 gauge black ground cable that's going into the amplifier. And I used the existing subwoofer output wires from this factory Sony amp back here to feed the high level input going into the amplifier. And again, it bridged it down to the 4 ohm 1-channel output that I need for the replacement 8-inch sub that I now have mounted in this factory Ford box that's in my truck. A few things. The factory amplifier to the factory subwoofer is a dual voice coil 2 ohm speaker, so each voice coil is 2 ohms. The replacement speaker I have in here, which is an 8-inch flat Exelon subwoofer, is a 4 ohm single voice coil sub. The output of this amp ideally is 4 ohms, 200 watts RMS, 350 watts peak, but 200 watts RMS is all I care about. 1 channel going to the subwoofer. The max power of that subwoofer, I think they claim, is 400 watts or something, but the RMS, or the actual continuous power you want to run to it, is much closer to 150 to 200 watts. And I've lined up the power output from this amplifier at 200 watts RMS at 4 ohms to the 200 watt RMS capable speaker that's back there. Now, typically, you want to custom build your enclosure for any type of aftermarket speaker because there's exact specifications for each speakers on the types of enclosure that they're supposed to be in and how they're supposed to perform best, whether it's going to be a sealed enclosure, a vented enclosure, how much airspace is inside, how much the cone's supposed to move. All those different things are factored into building enclosures for speaker boxes. But what I wanted to do before I built a custom enclosure was to see how this factory enclosure performed. And I'm telling you, there's probably a third of a cubic foot of airspace inside of that box. The sub that I put in there is a super thin or shallow mounted sub. It's only 2.5 inches deep total. And if I didn't have the child seat in right now, I'd throw the seat down so you could actually see the sub, but I'll put a picture of it up so you know exactly which sub I purchased. Now, one of the things that really impressed me right off the bat was how sealed the box is. Of course, it's plastic, so they can seal it real well, but the factory sub, when I removed it, the hole was actually about a 1/4 inch too small in diameter for the new sub to fit in, and they're 8-inch speakers. The factory ones, that dual voice coil 8-inch Sony, the Kenwood would not drop in, so I had to use a Dremel tool and really round out the hole to make it big enough to fit the factory sub. But I put an extra gasket around it, and it is very well sealed. Now what I want to do is turn the stereo on from up front so you can hear the bass response. I know that's going to be really difficult to do from your phone speaker, but if you have headphones or if you're playing it through Bluetooth on your car, I think you'll get kind of the idea of the improvement in sound of this system by adding this to it. Now I'm back inside the cab, and I'm very fortunate that this phone that I use to record video, if you saw the video on what I use for recording gear, it's the LG G6, but I use it for everything. It has no service on it. This is the phone I have, which is another G6, and it has service on it, but I use this one exclusively for filming. Now, one of the things that I really like about the LG G6 is that it has a really good microphone for recording audio. And what I want to do here is hopefully play some music, and you'll be able to hear the bass response through the speaker. And if you have headphones, again, you'll be able to hear it through there or even on your Bluetooth in your car. But it is ridiculous. It really brought the system to life. The bass is extremely deep and much more intense than it used to be. And it shakes my mirrors now, and it gives you that effect of having definitely a much larger system. Now, I'm not a big bass fan. I don't really care about having the type of bass that you pull up next to cars and you annoy everybody. I do listen to rock music, and I really like when that bass drum on the music just feels like it's kind of really punching you. I really like that type of intensity when I'm listening to certain music. So I have a song keyed up here, and I'm only going to play a couple of seconds of it so you can kind of get the idea of what I'm talking about. I just did a quick Amazon music search for bass music so you can hear that too. pretty horrible music. Anyways, I hope this kind of gives you the idea of what replacing your factory sub and adding an aftermarket amp can do. I have my system ran at 4 ohms. I don't like to bridge the amp down if I can avoid it, only because I don't want to put excessive heat through it, and I'm not running any really massive system. It's basically just a replacement sub, replacement amplifier in the factory sub box, and I simply use the wires that would normally feed to the sub for my high-level inputs, and my speaker wires come out of the amp directly into the new sub. Worked out really well. Probably the single biggest complication with the entire project was just the fact that the sub enclosure wasn't big enough, and I had to Dremel it out and make it about a 1/4 inch bigger in diameter so the speaker would drop in. Aside from that, I really didn't run into any problems. Anyways, guys, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope the sound comes across like I was intending it to. Again, you might need to wear headphones. You might need to put it on a bigger speaker so you can hear what I'm talking about. But the bass response is simply, hard to explain how much better it sounds, how much harder it hits. I definitely recommend sealed enclosures because it gives you that much more punchier sounding, richer and cleaner sounding bass than a vented enclosure. But you really wouldn't be able to vent this enclosure and get that type of sound. You'd have to really build a custom enclosure, and I didn't want to do that. So I hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Thanks, everyone.